welcome back, everyone, to the Nerd Out.
Welcome. New digs.
Yes.
New digs.
Look how nice it looks.
Oh, I feel
blue.
It's beautiful.
It is.
So
it's very fun. Well, how are you doing this morning?
I'm well. My coffee is digesting, so I'm doing good.
Coffee. Greatest way to start the morning.
It's part of the grace of God.
It is. It is. How do you take your coffee?
I am a foo-foo coffee person, and so I'm not like some of you. You like black coffee. I cannot understand you, but there's enough grace for all of us. So I'm a latte type person. So I try to limit myself to 2 a week because I'm an expensive coffee person. So
awesome, very cool. So
you?
I'm a weirdo. I like black coffee, just black.
Hannah, that's awesome.
Yep, just solid black drip coffee. Occasionally, I'll trip myself to a cold brew.
Okay. I tried a cold brew once, and I did not like it at all. It was like way too, not tart.
Bitter.
Bitter.
Yeah.
Way too bitter.
Depends on where you go.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, coffee, grace of God.
Yep.
Especially on a Monday morning. Well, we are continuing our series through the book of Philippians and going through last night, covering verses 11 through 18, 20-ish.
Yeah.
And all about Paul advancing the gospel. Can you quickly recap just the 3 main points from last night?
Yeah. There's really one, and that is endure suffering in a way and trusting in the sovereignty of God, that he's at work even when you feel like it's not the way it should be. I think Paul's a great example of that. We kind of walk through his life and the transitions that were a part of his life all the way back to, 34 AD-ish when Christ gets a hold of his life, changes him from the Pharisee of Pharisees who's hunting down Christians to converting and becoming a follower of Jesus, and then seclusion, missionary journeys, and then into where he's under house arrest the first time there in Rome. But there's a whole lot that leads up to that, which for most of us, I think if we went through it, I can speak for myself. If I went through it, I'd be asking the question, why is this happening to me? Life's not fair. And we've all logged time in scenarios and situations where we said that life's not fair. And yet that's not the question Paul's wrestling with. He actually gets to the place of saying, no, actually what's happened to me, it's advancing the gospel. And that was the main takeaway, that endurance and perseverance through suffering. And there's a lot we can go to with that. But I think to keep our head down and trust that God's at work is a big deal, and an invitation for us to experience Christ a little bit more. He writes, I think it's in 1 Thessalonians, he writes, I want to know the fellowship of his sufferings. So there's a fellowship side, an intimacy with God that grows only in the season of hardship, of difficulty, of suffering, that we can grow our intimacy with Christ. And there, better than when we're on the mountaintops and everything's great and beautiful. And so Paul's a great example for us to follow.
Why is that? So how is it that the more intimate times are in suffering? Why is that? Why does God do his most powerful work in the crushing, suffering moments?
Yeah, I think we can relate to it when you think of our friendships or our family dynamics and relationships, that when we go through hard times together, there's something that just, it blends your heart together, fuses your spirit together in a way that you're accomplishing something or enduring or persevering through something that there's no shortcuts to that. So there's an endurance side to that I think we come to know each other. We could come to trust. So when we go through those hard times and the Lord is with us, we can grow in our intimacy with him because we're getting to experience his grace, his mercy, his presence. We're able to rest into his sovereignty, even when we're struggling, and a different level than when everything is smooth sailing. So I don't know if there's a a answer to the why that is, other than I think we feel it and intuitively know it even in our personal relationships, that when you go through the fire with someone, it just bonds your heart with them in a way that just skimming along the top of life and everything is okay, or peachy and rosy, just you don't get the same depth of connection.
With Paul's perspective shift, going from like, well, not from, but like for us, we go, why is this happening? Life isn't fair, to having Paul's perspective of this is advancing the gospel. How can we make that jump in our own walks with whatever circumstances we might be going through?
Yeah, I think we talked last night just about growing our kingdom mindset. That that's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's an opportunity for us when we're going through suffering to expand our vision, expand our scope, not to be stuck on, okay, woe is me, why is this happening to me, life's not fair, but to see and begin to ask different questions. God, how can you shape my own character in the midst of enduring this season of suffering or hardship or struggle? What are some things that you're trying to work on in me? In the same way that a sculptor is chipping away at a marble or a marble statue, there's friction, there's tension, but it's going to get to something beautiful, but it has to go through a process first. And the same for us, that we have to go through a process sometimes. And so the Lord is always kind of doing some things that we can cooperate with and lean into. It's not an easy thing to say yes to, but it's a necessary thing to say yes to. And I think expanding our scope to ask different questions. So, God, how can you use me? What can I learn through this? And staying open to those and looking for how God might be answering that question.
Yeah, one of my favorite verses is in Isaiah where it says you're being refined through the furnace of suffering. And it is a character refining thing to go through suffering. And that could look differently on different people, different circumstances. But the Lord is always refining, whether it's in good or bad times. But it is true in the furnace of suffering, you are just more attentive to what God might be doing. And so I think asking those key questions is a good way of just recalibrating your heart to what is true, what is right, what is the kingdom mind. And elaborate what is when we say kingdom mindset, what does that mean? When Jesus talks about, the kingdom of heaven, elaborate on what it means to be kingdom minded.
It's the push back against the cultural movement of our time, that it's not about me. It's to say, God, it's about you, your plans, your initiatives, your heart, the things that are most important to you. I want that to become more and more important to me. And that, I think, whereas the American dream and the kingdom dream come into conflict. And it's not that we can't have nice things. It's not that we can't long for that or even pursue that, but it is the idea that that's not my first and foremost initiative or inkling. Is I want to see the things of God advance. So it's the prayer that we've been practicing. God, let your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And part of that is, God, I want your ways, your heart, the way things operate in heaven to be a little bit more the way they operate here. And I want my heart to be inclined toward that. And I think that's where Paul says, hey, the gospel is advancing. And in that, he's got the right mindset to see, I want to see the ways of God move, not just my preferences or my circumstances be more comfortable. And that's not an easy thing to wrestle with, but it's an opportunity for us.
How can we advance the gospel?
We can cooperate with what the Holy Spirit's inviting us to do. I think it's putting Jesus' story out there more and more for people to see and experience. Was it St. Francis that talked about, preach the gospel always and on occasion use words. So it is the way, There we go. It's the way we go about living our life in a practical sense of helping people, speaking kindness. It's living out the fruit of the Spirit and interacting with people that way. At the same time, when the opportunity arises, we can point to, hey, here's what Jesus means to me. Here's what my life with him is different now because I'm walking life with him. And the invitation is open to you to experience that. Why don't you come and get curious about Jesus?
I think all of that can be done whether you're going through good or bad times. And I think that's one of the things that it's very easy in the day-to-day to hopefully to keep that on the forefront. But when you are going through suffering and you're going through painful trials, like it is really hard to continue that kingdom mindset of like, well, this could be for somebody else. Like what I'm going through could be used for somebody else. And that's a hard thing to sit with as you're going through your own trials, is like, this could be for somebody else. And you may not even know it.
You may never know it.
And that's a hard thing to trust God with, is like this trial, the circumstances is advancing the gospel possibly for somebody else.
Right.
And like not knowing that's I think another part of our faith is the unknown of what could be happening with that. We talk about the sovereignty of God. That is a very big theological word. What is the sovereignty of God? What does that mean? How do we trust the sovereignty of God?
Yeah. So A.W. Tozer writes about this in The Attributes of God, Volume 2, I think. And he comes at it, I think, from the best possible angle. So I'm going to give credit to A.W. Tozer because this is not original with me. But he talks about the sovereignty of God, meaning God is all-powerful, all-knowing. He knows everything. And so in that, he has sovereignty over all things. At the same time, because we are made in the image of God, he has given a little bit of sovereignty to us. And so we have the ability to make our own choices, to make our own decisions. But that's within reason. So like, for example, he gives the illustration of a cruise ship. And so a cruise ship is leaving one port and going to another. That's its final destination is where it's going. Now, when you're on the cruise ship, you can do whatever you like. You can go play shuffleboard. You can go to the show and catch a show. You can hang out in your room. You can walk around the deck and have a drink. But the reality is the destination's all going to end up at the same spot. You may be experiencing different things or even choosing different things, but it's all going somewhere. And so the sovereignty of God rests in the fact that God is moving this to a place. He's giving us freedom to choose him or to not choose him, freedom to walk in alignment with him or to not walk in alignment with him. But he still oversees all things, because the question is, okay, why does a good God allow bad things to happen? Or why is evil so much part of our world? And I don't know if I have an easy answer for that, except that God allowed it, but he still supersedes it, he still oversees it, and he's still sovereign over it. And so it is going to a conclusion at some point, and he knows that, and he's got that, and I can rest in that. I can trust him in that. But I'm still given freedom with a little bit of the Imago Dei in me to either exercise my sovereignty in a small scope. I have a little bit of opportunity to do some things or to not do some things. He's given me leeway, given you leeway, given us leeway to do that. No, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
And if we've been gifted that, how do we, like the Philippians for Paul, how do we do that for others who are going through the midst of suffering or trials? Like, how do we showcase the sovereignty of God for others?
Yeah, I think a part of that is it's having a heart of comfort and mercy for other people, to come alongside them and maybe ask through prayer, God, would you use me to help be, we use this phrase a lot of, to help be Jesus with skin on, in a way to the people that are going through hardships or difficulties that we want God's presence to be with them, and he is, But at the same time, maybe my physical presence and my ability to do some things can actually help be in partnership with the Spirit to help them feel that and to sense God's with them. So even, like we practiced last night of just, hey, take a moment to pray for someone and literally text them. So we had everyone pull out their phone and text somebody a prayer and let them know they're praying for them. And I had a couple people come up afterwards and say, here's the text response from my friend that they so much appreciated that. So that's a small, tangible way of just saying, hey, I'm sitting on the curb with you. We talk about Romans 12:15 all the time, that I think human relationships would be in a much better place if we just practiced a Bible verse, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And part of mourning with someone is not shouting from the sideline, here's the 4-step plan of how you can overcome this. Part of it's just sitting on the curb with them and going, gosh, this really stinks, and I'm sorry for that. I'm just going to sit here with you, and I'll help, and we'll figure out the next steps, but I'm just here with you. And I think that's the Philippians church heart for Paul is, Paul, we've seen all this hardship and struggle you've gone through and what you've endured. We think we know. Would you let us know? And we want you to know that we're with you, we're in your corner. I tell couples all the time that I do their wedding, the pre-marriage coaching is, hey, as long as I'm on the planet, I'm in your corner. That I want to be a person that comes alongside. Most people won't call when things are great. They'll call when things are struggle. And to say, hey, I'm going to be an advocate for you and with you in the midst of the heartache, in the midst of the struggle. I'll be with you as you go through that.
And all of that is to, as Paul said, advance the gospel. Why is that so important to Paul? And then why should that be important to us?
I think that's part of the kingdom mindset. Of saying it's about the ways of God, the kingdom of God, the reign of God on this earth, that I want to care more about that than just my little kingdom of what I can carve out and create for my own life and the story that I can write. I want to be a part of a bigger story. That's God's story that started long before that Jesus showed up on the planet. But the crescendo is Jesus's life and death and resurrection. And now the movement of God that's welcoming people back into relationship with him through Jesus. That's what he's wanting to see. People get caught up in the tidal wave of grace that God's unleashed through his son for them to find relationship with him. And so for me as a follower of Jesus, and I want nothing more than to see people experience the fact that they don't have to live life on their own and for their own, in the sense that they don't have to carve out their own story. It's actually a better story to be enfolded into and be rescued by God's grace and invited into a relationship with him. And I think we jokingly said, I wonder if Paul, at some point in this 2-year house arrest where soldiers are being traded out every 6 hours of a shift, that maybe he began to see that as an opportunity for each new person, each new soldier to come in. Hey, here's my opportunity to invite them into a bigger story. They know why I'm here, so let me help paint the picture for them to experience that. So for us as believers, as followers of Jesus, it's, God, how can I live today, Monday, in a way that I can point people toward you and toward your story of grace and hope, and invite people into that by the way I interact with them, by the way that I take thought of them, by the way that I don't think less of them, but I actually begin to see them with the Imago Dei, that even if they are attributing something that I would say, gosh, that's not toward God's best, but they still have high value because God says they have high value. And so therefore, I'm going to reflect that same value, that you're valuable to me because God says so. And so I'm going to choose to love you and see you that way, even if I may disagree with you on certain aspects of how you're living life. I'm going to choose to put value into you and on you because God says so. So it's the way we interact with people. And I think when we earn the right to speak into someone's life, we earn the right to invite them a little bit closer to the one that's impacting us and changing us. So I think it's just trying to live, we used binoculars last night to talk about kind of the spiritual binoculars that, in a way, often we can just see our scope of influence, our little world, and binoculars help you see beyond that. And I think that's what Paul is saying is, listen, if I looked at just my little life, I've been in prison for 4 years, and I'm not able to travel and do what I want to do and what I have been doing, but maybe God's leveraging this bigger than I realize. And so how can I seize the moment I'm in and point people toward the hope and light of Jesus in this moment and in this scenario? And that's what he began to do.
He goes on to talk about people who continue to share the gospel, but possibly with the wrong motivation. How can we guard our hearts against misrepresenting him, or how can we guard our hearts to make sure that we are sharing the gospel with the pure motive? Because he goes on to talk about, that some are doing it, for selfish ambition or in vain, and nevertheless the gospel's going out, and so it's a win. But how can we make sure that we are representing him authentically?
Yeah, I think where he's going with that is some people are basically they're trying to present the gospel and make a name for themselves because, hey, Paul's he's not in the picture anymore. And so I'm going to step forward. And I think it's perspective. Am I trying to make a name for myself, or am I trying to promote the name above all names? And I really think it's that simple. If my life and if my interactions with people are trying to point people to the one that I'm following, great. If I'm trying to point to myself to get more followers for myself, then I think that's where the tension is. I think that's what Paul's saying. At the end of the day, we're still talking about Jesus, but I think it's the heart motive behind it is what he's getting at. And so maybe it's just checking our own heart motive in why we're doing what we're doing. Even when we're trying to serve people, and we're trying to make it about us, or we trying to invite people closer to Jesus in that.
Well, is there anything that you didn't get a chance to go through last night?
So one of the stories I was going to share is, we didn't get the chance to talk about that there's fellowship in the suffering that Paul alludes to in Thessalonians, where he talks about, okay, it's understanding that it's in these seasons of suffering or hardship or difficulty where our intimacy with Jesus can grow to a deeper level. But we hit that a little bit, but he talks about either way. So either the believers, brothers and sisters, are stepping forward in faith, or some people are trying to make a name for themselves. But either way, Jesus is getting talked about, and so it's all good with me, and that's why he has joy. He talks about that. So again, he writes about joy from prison, under house arrest. Things aren't the way he would probably want them to be, but he's living into the moment that they are and saying, God, how can you be at work in the midst of this? And because he's saying the story is too good not to share. Then I'm all about the sharing of the story of the gospel of Jesus and his hope. And it made me think of an old car commercial that Mercedes-Benz did. I don't know if you remember the commercial where Mercedes-Benz would rev up, and it's in a test track, and they would run a car into a wall. And they would do this over and over. So crash testing, we have all seen the crash test dummies, but crash testing actually started with Chevy in 1936, late 1930s. But it was 1950s, mid to late 1950s, that Mercedes-Benz actually went all in on crash testing. And they began to come up with a body design, a frame of the body of the car design that would distribute the force that happens when you get in an accident, so that it wouldn't be on the human body, it would be distributed throughout the car, and they put a patent on it. And so they put a patent on this. They started filming these crash test things into a cement wall at 45, 55 miles an hour. And there's one commercial where they do this, and then a rep is asked, well, how come you guys aren't enforcing your patent? And other companies are starting to use similar design, crumple zones, we call them today. That was the distribution of the force. And he looks at the camera and says, because some things are too good not to share, or too important not to share. And I just think that's a beautiful look at what the gospel and Paul's attitude, that, okay, some people are trying to make a name for themselves, but they're talking about Jesus. And other people are stepping up. And yes, my situation, I'd like to be in a different situation or a different circumstance, but the story is being shared. The gospel is getting out. People are hearing about the hope and light of Jesus. You know what? Some things are too important not to share, and I'd rather it get shared. And I think it's a great reminder that a kingdom-minded person says, you know what? It's not about my story. I have a part to play, and I'm significant and I'm valuable, so I matter. But at the end of the day, it's Jesus who matters most. And it's his story that's going to actually bring change and transformation in the lives of people. And so everything I can do to help point people to that story, I want to see that happen. And I want to lean into that a little bit more each year. So maybe the question to ask yourself is, hey, do I care more about Jesus' story this year than I did 5 years ago? Am I still trying to make it all about my story? Am I still trying to grow my story? It's not that you can't. But is that front burner or is that back burner? Front burners needs to be the story of God, and how can my life help point people to the story of God in the way I interact with them, the way I treat them, the way I love on them, the way I can talk about inviting them a little bit closer to the one that I know that wrote that story, and such. But so Mercedes-Benz commercial, there you go.
I think one of those, a good kind of heart check that also will, practically advance the gospel is sharing your testimony.
Totally.
I think that's all. Whenever I hear people's testimonies, you can always tell like who is on the spotlight with those. And, I like to read a lot of books, so I read a lot of autobiographies of people telling their stories. But what's different from an autobiography and a testimony is where God is getting the glory. He's the front.
Right.
He's the main character. And so I think even practicing your testimony, seeing like, are you the main character in your testimony, or is it on God? And so I think that's just a kind of a practical way of one, just for your own practice of like checking your heart, but also to share your testimony and to share what God has done in and through your life with others really is one of the best and easy ways to share that with others, because no one can doubt that. No one can question what God has done in and through your life. And he talks about being partakers of grace. And part of that is just, just sharing the grace that you've experienced with others. And last night we did go back into, you referenced Paul's other letter in book of Romans, in Romans 8, about like all things, working together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. Especially the book of Romans, what's that significance there? Why did you pick Romans, and kind of going through that passage? Yeah,
I think because when you're dealing with suffering, nobody wants to be in suffering. You're weird if you do. So no one wants to log time in that season or that scenario. But it's also, it's coming back to the sovereignty of God, that he will cause all things to work together for good, even things that are not good. And we talked about, even like for some of you, there's been things done to you, choices and decisions other people made that are not good. And they're not okay, and it's okay for them to not be okay. And it's okay to seek health and help in that. And it's not okay that you went through that. But God has a way of saying, hey, even though you went through that, I'm going to redeem that. I'm going to take you. I've seen so many people through the years who have gone through hardships that were not their decision. It was someone else's decision to either do harm or hurt to them. But God has redeemed that in a way of saying, I'm not going to let that scar be the rest of your story. I'm going to actually heal that, and I'm going to help you use that incident, that tragedy, that hardship that you went through to now point people to the grace. So you talk about your testimony. maybe part of that is your testimony of saying, hey, I went through X, whatever that might be, and I didn't choose it, or maybe you did, and you're the one who put yourself on a trajectory and you went through hardship because of the decisions you made, and you got to the end of it and you realize this is not fulfilling. It's not the significance I was hoping it was going to be, or you're realizing from your story, this is not okay. And it's not good that I went through it, but God, would you redeem it? Would you heal this? Would you help me to then point people to the healer? So my testimony becomes, okay, I went through this hurt, this pain, but I have a healer that helped me and that healed me. And my scar now tells his story. That scars always tell a story. So I've got a scar over my right eye from when I was dumb as a kid and was jumping off my bed into a beanbag, and I hit a wooden chair and knocked a hole in my head, and they literally had to take me to the hospital, and nurses had to hold me down, and they had to put stitches right by my eye. And so anything that goes by my eye, I'm still freaked out by, because I remember that as a 5-year-old. But at the same time, every scar tells a story, and it could be not just your story of what you endured, but the story of God and how he helped you and how he healed you going through that. And so when you share your testimony, I love that point. Don't feel like, because I think sometimes people feel a burden to go, okay, I got to share my testimony. Here's my whole life. No. Share a portion of your testimony. Your testimony is just a story of what God's done to help you. So if I'm a person in my childhood who struggled with insecurity, I can then speak to the idea of the security and the hope and the confidence I found in God and what he says about me and not what I say about myself, and how he's helped me unwrap and unpack the idea that I can live in the confidence of God. And the security of my relationship with him now shapes me, and I get to see the world not from an insecure position, but from a stance and a perspective of confidence and security in who God is and who God says I am. And I didn't manufacture that. I didn't create that. That's been a gift from the Lord. That's one portion of a testimony. And so find a portion that fits for you. And you don't have to have a testimony of, well, I was a drug dealer and a biker and, I did all this. Like, you don't have to have an extreme testimony. You can have a unique testimony. And your unique testimony can speak into the lives of other unique people that God's already at work in the background of their life and wants to show his presence and his awareness of them. And maybe what you went through will actually help connect the dots to someone else who went through something similar, and they can begin to see, oh, there is hope, there is healing, there's an opportunity that I don't have to let the scar be my story. I can actually let the scar lead me to the one who has a better story, and that can enfold me into his story.
I think to the point about testimonies needing to be extreme, testimonies are extreme. When we think about God's grace, I love the verse in Colossians where it says you were transferred from darkness
into light.
Into light. Like what God does in and through a person's life, like when you are face to face with God's grace, like that is extreme, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what it is. And so I think people underestimate the power of a testimony. One, for you just to remind yourself what God has done through your life, like that is extreme. But also for others, like it could be a non-extreme circumstances, and yet like you really never know what will click with another person or what will speak to them, and that's just the beauty of what God does. And I think part of just the way I study the brain for school, and our brains are wired for stories. We crave stories and hearing stories, and that's I think why Jesus spoke in parables and spoken stories. Like there's something about a story that captures the hearts. And so I think just the encouragement is one, just to share your testimony, share the story of what God has done, past, present, and future. I think one of the things I'm always reminded of is like God didn't just save you from your past, but who you would have become. And just sitting in that has always been just a humbling, sobering moment for me of like, God saved me from who I could have been is a sobering, terrifying thought as well. But when we talk about Paul and his testimony, that he is also a Roman and Jewish citizen. Without getting into our dual citizenship later in Philippians.
Good segue.
Without covering into that, what is the significance, again, of especially being where he's at, Paul being both a Roman and a Jewish citizen?
Well, that's how he got to where he's at. In a sense that if he was not a Roman citizen, he could say the words, "I appeal to Caesar," and they would be like, whatever. But because he's a Roman citizen, that brought him some credence in credentials that got him to the place of getting to Rome. And yes, he was Jewish. Yes, he was Roman citizen. Do I know how all that played out? No, I don't. But we know it's true because he says it, and it's confirmed in the circumstances, the story that plays out. And so there is a dual citizenship that I think was unique to Paul. And I actually wonder if that's part of the reason Jesus chose Paul in the first place. There's always the story when the pastor said, who's like, and again, this is a story. It's not a biblical story. Of Jesus gets back to heaven after the resurrection, and God the Father says, "You left the kingdom in charge of with those 12. We're gonna need backup." And so Jesus appears to Paul, brings him, and Paul is a Pharisee of Pharisees, meaning he is upper echelon of smarts and ability. N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, says he was on the level of Aristotle and Plato, like the best educated and know-how. And so there's a lot of training in Paul's background before God gets a hold of him through faith in Jesus and changes the whole trajectory of his life. So his testimony is extreme, going from persecutor of the church, trying to wipe out people of the way, people of Jesus, to now being the chief champion of the people of Jesus and the way of Jesus, and promoting that. So I don't know if that got to your question. I got rambling there. Sorry.
It did. Any final thoughts or words of encouragement for people as they go into this next week?
I think I would encourage you. So I'm going to ask you a question in this sense. I would love for you to share a portion of your testimony, of maybe what you would say, hey, I was this, and God actually began to work on me. So I'll share another portion of mine. I was a really fearful kid growing up, and a lot of fear in me. And I don't know what drove that, why that was a part, but God began to heal me of that. I was incredibly shy, which was really just pride and fear. People talk about shyness, and it's not that you have to be an extrovert, and that you can't be an introvert. It's not that. There was a pride side of that I heard about. God, it was one sermon that my mentor shared one time, one sentence in a sermon that God just used. The Holy Spirit was like, "That's you, man." And I was like, "What?" And I began to bring that to the Lord of like, why am I shy? Why am I fearful? And God began to chip away at some of those hesitations and the fear of man, and the fear of embarrassing myself, or the fear of not being able to live up to people's expectations or God's expectations or my expectations. And God began to heal me of again, coming to a place of resting that who he is and what he says about me is enough. And I don't have to live in the fear of people. Now, do I still struggle with that at times? Yes, because I'm human, and I bet you do too at times. But I am not one who struggles with that as much as I did, because of God's healing in that. So I'm curious for you in this sense. What would be maybe part of your testimony, your story, your narrative? I know you study the brain, and you're absolutely right. We think in narrative. And so I think that's the beauty of the invitation of God, is to unfold ourselves into his story, which is bigger and greater than our story. So,
I know for me, growing up with a strange fear of death. I had my first experience with church was after 9/11. And that was the first time where I had seen church, and I was just, for me, I was a young kid, I was 9, and I saw all these people mourning after the attacks on 9/11, and I didn't understand that level of death. And then fast forward a little bit, I came to know Jesus at a memorial service. I had heard the gospel as clear as could be presented at that service, and it was, for me, it was the hope of heaven, and just to know that I didn't need to fear death. I didn't need to fear what would happen if I had died, or any of those things. I had a hope of heaven presented to me in a very real, very powerful way of like, this isn't our home. This wasn't where I needed to stay, that this wasn't it, that there is something beyond this life. And so for me, it was the gospel being presented, that he rose from the grave. Like, the resurrection for me was incredibly powerful to know
That's
that
awesome.
there is something more than this. There's something more beyond loss and pain and death, that there's eternal life.
Yeah.
And that's the greatest gift anybody could ask for. So
That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
I think that is part of the kingdom mindset that Paul's seeing. Okay, my circumstance is this, but there is something more. There's something more going on. Something more going on in your life. God helped you see that. Something more going on for me. God helped me begin to see that. I think God's helping Paul see, okay, your scenario, your scope, there's actually something more. Let's use the binoculars. Let's see out here. I'm still on the move, and I'm still at work, and the gospel is advancing. And that's what mattered most to Paul. And so I know for some of you, you may be going through some hardship, some challenge. And if it's all right with you, I'd love to maybe close our nerd out a little bit different, and just praying for you and praying for us as we navigate suffering, hardship, difficulty, challenges, whatever word you want to put to that, that we would have a growing kingdom mindset to see, God, what can you do through this to help shape me to be more and more who you want me to be, who you're calling me to be, and also to persevere in a way that I would see the bigger scope, the bigger story going on. So if that's all right, awesome. So let's pray. God, I pray for each one watching this, whether they go to Elements or not. God, you know their story. You know the details of the background of whether something's been done to them that's gotten them to a place of entering into a season of suffering, or a trajectory of decisions and choices that they've made that have led them down a path, and this is where they find themselves. God, I pray that you would, rescue and heal each soul, that you would redeem each one and invite them into relationship with your Son, Jesus. And through that, and through the confidence of faith that we have in him, that you would go about writing a greater, better story that you've already in the process of creating, and that you would invite them to see that and include themselves into that story. And so we ask for your hope and your grace and your mercy to burst anew and afresh. Would you give them eyes to see maybe ways that you want to chip away at some things in their character, their heart, to begin to reshape them more and more into who you're calling them to be and inviting them to be through your grace and through your power. So we ask your blessing over them this week, and we thank you for the opportunity to hang out for a little bit here online. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.